I'm delighted to welcome you on this day of great moment, and we're very lucky to have three legal minds who will discuss the legacy and the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg from different angles. My name is Jamie Steem. I'm class of '82. I live in Washington. I'm a columnist and a historian. So I will be moderating, and I'd like to introduce you first to Judge Jed Rickoff.
Hello.
He's who is a federal district judge for the Southern District of New York. He's also a public intellectual, and he was appointed by the same president as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, President Clinton. Now, I understand that the judge is personal friends with Ginsburg and will share some memories, you know, more sort of off the record glimmers into her character. Second, we have Andrea Young, the class of '76. She is the ACLU executive director for the state of, wait for it, Georgia. So she's she's caught in crosshairs right now, and she will address how the ACLU gave Justice Ginsburg her great career advocating for the cause and the status of women. Last but not least, we have the Attorney General of Colorado, Phil Weiser. Hello, Phil. Phil is the class of 1990. And he was a clerk for Justice Ginsburg around 95 or 96, shortly after she joined the Supreme Court. And he'll share some glimpses of her workaday world and how, you know, she churned out so many opinions that were so incredibly on point, and what her work habits were like. Is that fine with you, Phil? And I might add that Judge Rakoff, Jed, was class of '64. So we have a nice generation.
You didn't know the college went back that far, did you?
That's no time at all. So let me just make a few observations first and send some themes, and then you can develop them. The panel will have a discussion, and the second half of the hour, I'll take questions and direct them to our panelists. They can expand on them. So first of all, there was such a groundswell of grief in Washington this summer. Actually, it was September. And it was almost as if the Supreme Court was a wailing wall. People came from so far. They stood in long lines for different reasons, but it all kind of added up to love and inspiration, because Justice Ginsburg was so much more than a Supreme Court justice. She was a public friend to the city. You saw her not only at the opera, but also at the theater and the symphony. And she had this genius for making friends in different spheres. But more than any other prominent Washingtonian, you would see her at the Kennedy Center just because she wanted to hear that Beethoven violin concerto. She might not be with anybody else. So, and before we launch into a discussion, let me add that she reminds me of Lucretia Mott, a founder of the college who was a champion of anti-slavery and the founder of women's rights. She was an incredible visionary, and she had moral charisma, just like Justice Ginsburg. I like to think they were like history sisters. And Lucretia Mott was the most important woman in antebellum America. So let me just make that statement, a claim. And the theme that jumps out at me, because I like to write and speak about outsiders, she was an outsider. When she graduated from law school, she was excluded and shunned by the legal establishment. And so I think the rest of her life, she remembered what that felt like to be an outsider. And she became the most senior woman in the American government, along with Speaker Pelosi, but she never forgot what it felt like to be discriminated against. And I think that explains her incredible journey that took her not only to advance her own career, but the legal status of women in her lifetime. Think what progress she made. And she just is very parallel to Thurgood Marshall in that way. Both of them, before coming to the court, made great advances for people of color and for women. So if you agree with that or disagree, please speak up. She was a giant of her time, but there was so much more to her than, she was so much more than a justice.
Just to put
a giant.
A footnote though on
Mhm.
what you said, it wasn't really until she got to law school that she began to appreciate how much she was being discriminated against. When she in high school at James Madison High School, which I thought showed great prescience on her part, she was a cheerleader. It's hard to think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg out there, but and
I was also a cheerleader. Just
there you go. There you go. And then when she went to college, she met Marty Ginsburg, who was her fantastic husband. She had a boyfriend at the time already, but Marty had a Chevrolet, so there was really no contest. She was a much more traditional person until she got to law school.
So she was politicized by that. Andrea, would you like to speak to that, or Phil?
Well, I think Phil probably has more insight into that. I was just defending the cheerleaders, that cheerleaders are still telling people what to do. So it's actually, it's within the context of what was acceptable for women in that time. It is a leadership responsibility. So, but
that's a revealing point. Yes.
If cheerleaders are people who tell you what to do, then I am sorry I haven't recognized that the Court of Appeals as my cheerleaders.
Well, Phil, you may want to comment on how her character, as how she became politicized from going to law school and being, looking for a job that she couldn't find at first.
Yeah, well, first I had to give the Marty point. As I understand it, it was not about the Chevrolet, but in her words, that he made her laugh, which I think is a beautiful standard to have in mind when thinking about a partner in life. So that's the first point. As for the moment that you've put it on, it's a really important point. So she graduates from law school. She's at the top of her class, and she couldn't get a job anywhere. And Sandra Day O'Connor had the same experience. No one would hire her. In her, as she talked about it, she was a woman, she had a child, and she was Jewish. And back then, Jews were getting torn down by most of the major law firms. So it was for her, if you will, 3 strikes. What ended up happening, this is inspiration for mentors. Her mentor, Gerald Gunther, a professor, said to a judge, I'm going to let our good judge here, Jed, explain a little more of the backstory, because it was a judge on the, I believe, was it Southern District or
Yeah, he was on my court, Edmund Palmieri.
So Edmund Palmieri was told by Professor Gerald Gunther, if you don't hire her, we will never send you another clerk from Columbia again. And by the way, I've got a man who, if she doesn't work out, I'll just swap him in for you.
Oh, really? This is the beauty of having this, intersection, because these are small details about her that kind of add up to a portrait. Somebody took a stand for her, Professor Gunther, and if he hadn't done that, then she might not have had an entree at all. So maybe that she carried with her the sense that somebody stuck up for me, and I've got to do that. I've got to pass that along, carry it forward. Andrea, what
I was
are
going
your
to say, it's
sense?
also that sense of being the first but not the last, right? And so I think part of telling that story is, she is responsible for changing so much of that, right? So she had that experience, and she used that to change it so that now, a young lawyer can't even imagine
That's right.
coming out at the top of your class and not getting an interview. I mean, the fact that some of the things she personally experienced are so unimaginable today is a result of her own work, her own intervention
That's
into the law
absolutely.
traditions that made that true.
In her sense of like the greater good and opening doors that were locked. So her personality was, I've never met her, but Jeffrey Rosen is a friend of mine, and he wrote a book about her. She seems rather understated in person. Is that right? Or Phil, maybe you'd like to carry that?
Understated is it's to my mind not the quite word. What I would say is she is soft spoken, and when she speaks slowly, because every single word she uses, she's thought about carefully. And I'll tell you, every word and every opinion she ever wrote, she thought about carefully. So for people who aren't familiar with her, don't know what to expect, you would coach them and say, when she pauses, don't assume that she's done. She might be thinking about what she's going to say next.
That was a lesson you learned in the chambers where it happened. Tell us a little more about your daily, education working for Justice Ginsburg.
Well, let me just give a word about her work style, which is not maybe widely known. She would often not get in till 12 noon. She kept graduate student hours, really. And she would often stay till 9, 10 at night and then go home and work more. And but for Marty, she probably would have pulled regular all-nighters because she was so engrossed in her work, and she loved her work, and she was great at it. So Marty would bring her away from doing work, would also, they had shared loves together. You mentioned the opera. She was really a perfectionist.
Well, and you could sort of see it in the way she dressed and presented herself. Everything was very meticulous and intentional. So I
think she was very lucky in a way, in so many ways, to have Marty as her husband, because they balanced each other. So the way I first met her, this was in her pre-icon days, when she was on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and Marty was of counsel to the law firm that I was at the time. And when I was in Washington, he would invite me and my wife over to have dinner occasionally. And he would meet you at the door. He would be full of good cheer. He would immediately give you hors d'oeuvres that he had made. And indeed, he cooked the whole meal, and he did a fantastic job. But she was there, and every few minutes, in a very quiet, slow way, she would say something. And it was so effective. The very fact that she, not that she was artificially holding back, it was just her style, but you hung on her every word because each word was slow, meaningful, and insightful. And so they were a great balance. I should add that Marty Ginsberg, who died some years ago, was in his own right a very great lawyer, a tax lawyer, although he once said to me, and I think he said to others, that he had spent his life helping the rich to prevent the deprivations of the poor. So
Now, when we look Marty's way, as much as she was a pioneer and ahead of her time, he was ahead of his time too. They had a very unconventional marriage, and he was proud of that. He didn't resent it in any way. And as I gather, that he completely adored his wife, Ruth.
no question.
The Honorable Ruth, as he referred to her in a letter that Peter Faber from the class of 60s shared with us. He wrote a letter to a third grader who wrote an essay about a tax reform bill. And he said, the Honorable Ruth actually laughed out loud. That is a rare occurrence. he just, even in this letter, he is affectionately lighthearted, teasing her. And I always, that the friendship she had with Antonin Scalia, the very arch conservative jurist, he seems in personality to be a lot like Marty Ginsburg, very jovial and outgoing and, kind of loud. Is that why she was friends with Scalia? because they had that in common.
So I asked her about that once. I said, this is only a slight exaggeration. How can you be friends with that jerk? She said, he is a fantastic guy. He makes me laugh, apropos what was said about, in fact, she said there were a number of times on the bench in the Supreme Court when she had to kind of cover her mouth because of something he had whispered in her ear that was so funny. And of course, they also shared a love for opera. He was a dynamic figure. He was a very good writer. So there was a lot there that drew them together. In, when you think about this in the current climate, it is such a contrast and such an example of what we should all aspire to in our political life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me jump on that theme, and I know Andrea worked for Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy had that type of relationship with Orrin Hatch, and
that's right.
It is like Jed says, it's a sad statement that today we look at a friendship across viewpoints and ask, how does that happen? As opposed to asking, why don't we see more of that? Because like Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, Justice Ginsburg, Justice Scalia liked each other personally, respected each other, and they both believed in the enterprise of what they were both doing, even if they came at it from different perspectives. I
see. So you saw that in practice at the court, whether they're in session or not, they just had this warm mutual appreciation. Speaking of the Senate and Ted Kennedy, Andrea, you've come back to, you're from Atlanta, you're back in where you came from, but when you were working for Senator Kennedy, was there an overlap with the ACLU was doing at the same time?
Well, Laura Murphy Lee was the Washington office director, and so we certainly, collaborated and was, always influential. I mean, my connection to the ACLU actually goes back to my dad's first run for Congress.
Your father, Andrew Young?
Yeah, my father, Andrew Young. We're coming up on redistricting, and of course the Voting Rights Act was new at that time. And the ACL, and so in between the time my dad ran and lost and then was running again, they drew him out of the district, the one that was most recently represented by John Lewis. So the ACLU intervened using the Voting Rights Act to have those lines redrawn. Now, recently one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's important dissents, and she started talking about this, she was writing dissents sort of for the future, is that to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act, as they did in Shelby v. Holder, was like getting rid of an umbrella because it's raining and you're not getting wet in the rain. And so that's very much what we see, because we saw this explosion, of efforts to restrict, access to the ballot, particularly, for African Americans. So she has quite a good, quite a legacy, in voting rights, which of course is very much on people's minds right now as we, sort of witness, voter suppression attempts coming from the podium at the White House.
And you're right in the eye of the storm in Georgia right now as we speak. Can you discuss her vision of how the Voting Rights Act should have continued, onward, forward from 2013?
Her opinion is, her dissent is something that in Shelby v. Holder is something we cite quite a lot and will continue to until it becomes, the law again. Because of course, I was in the Senate when the Voting Rights Act was continually renewed, and it was renewed with overwhelming bipartisan support, like, overwhelmingly all across the Senate. And so, the idea that, all of a sudden, there's gambling in the casino, it was just, it just doesn't,
Yes.
and I think the outrage, the intensity of her dissent was, quite an important one. And the other connection, of course, to Ruth Bader Ginsburg is it was Jimmy Carter that put her on the Court of Appeals.
And she said if it hadn't been for him, he gave her her first opportunity to be a judge.
Her from the ACLU, from the
was that in 1980? I think it was in 1980. So her judicial temperament was just percolating for years before that. And since you have personal knowledge and you knew her, can you speak about her legacy and how the ACLU is trying to is finding ways to further her legacy? Any programs or any fellowships or anything like that?
I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Was that a question?
What did you get distracted by? If there's a question you'd like to answer, let me know. But you had mentioned how her legacy was very alive and well at the ACLU.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we essentially, had an all staff call. We had over 1,000 current and former staffers on a call to basically observe her passing. I mean, for an organization that depends on the Supreme Court for a lot to be effective in its work, I mean, it was a dagger to the heart to lose Justice Ginsburg. I mean, and for every woman lawyer at the ACLU, I mean, she is just the penultimate. I mean, Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that is why you went to, I mean, if you're an ACLU lawyer, that is who you want to be when you grow up. That is like Mount Olympus.
Yes.
And as we said, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is like the most successful graduate of the ACLU. So she's our star, she's like, she's our absolute star. So, and we've renamed, I mean, there is still a women's rights project at the ACLU. There's now a young woman of color who has that title that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has, and she had the opportunity to interview Justice Ginsburg and and has that recorded. And we have renamed one of the centers for Justice Ginsburg, and
that's a memory that she'll carry the rest of her life, and she'll carry it to her daughters and her colleagues. And I mean, there's so many stories of her kind of genius for with people, not only on a legal plane, but she appreciated all kinds of people. I have a vignette, charming vignette from Serge Seiden, class of '85. He was directing a production at the studio theater here in Washington called Bad Jews. And she came backstage, she met the cast, she invited the actors to come to the Supreme Court for oral arguments, and she invited them to her chambers. Now, how many people in her realm would take the time and the effort and enjoy the whole interaction? But, you know, she wasn't doing that for show. She was doing that because she loves the theater and she appreciates, you know, the creative process, as well as, of course, the legal visionary.
Before though we continue with all the things that made her so special, I think it's important to recognize how admired she was by other judges. And that's because she was a master of the craft. She was cautious. She immersed herself in the facts of every case before she let the law take over, so to speak. She was very open to views expressed by her colleagues and was not afraid to also try to persuade them to her point of view. These are traits that judges admire among their fellow judges, and she had all those traits to a great degree.
Well, thank you for that testament. That's you know, that's something that we wouldn't necessarily know about the you know, the realm of judges.
I know we want to get to some of the questions in the
yes.
chat. If I could just piggyback on that too, is that the brilliance of her strategy of using cases where men suffered from sex stereotypes.
Oh, right,
to expand rights for women. I mean, it was just brilliant. And I think one of the things she said in an interview was that, well, the Supreme Court then was all men. So I had to have arguments that and of course it's a perfect ACLU philosophy where we always are saying, we want this to be the rule no matter what side of the question you're on, right? So you have to have a rule that works for everybody. But that I think was just, when you look at the cases that she used to move rights for women, I mean, the brilliance of the strategy was just, you know, beyond belief. And again, to come up with that at a time when people didn't question these things, people didn't question that men were the executors of estates, people didn't question that it was women that stayed home with the kids. And that was the thing that made her so brilliant. I mean, her tactics were so brilliant.
Well, she came by it naturally. There's a great story she tells of her son, James, who is an active kid as sort of in elementary school. And she gets like the 5th call in a row about James and says to the school administrator, James has 2 parents. I suggest you alternate calls between myself and James's father. And after that, the frequency of the calls slowed down because the administrator thought, oh, I couldn't bother the father who's busy and working, but I could bother the mom, even though of course she had a busy career as well.
That's a great insight. I will move to the questions, and let me see. We have one from Doug Perkins. He's the class of 1980, who asks how Judge Ginsburg would feel about expanding the Supreme Court, which has come up in this campaign. Something to be studied. Would one of you like to take a stab at that?
Well, I think Phil knows more about this than I do, but I do know she was opposed to that idea. And to be frank, I think it can only serve to further politicize the court. So you expand the court to 11 during a Biden administration, then you have a Republican administration, you expand it to 13, and so on it goes. You don't solve any long-term problems, and you solve the short-term problems at the cost of the prestige and the cohesion and the non-politicization of the court.
Mhm. Thank you. We have a request from Bohian, who's the president of the Alumni Council. She would like to know, Jed, about your vacation, gallivanting.
Well,
Ginsburg.
gallivanting is something that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. The two do not quite go together. But this was around 2015 or so. Marty had died, and my wife Ann and I had the great privilege of going with Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Switzerland, where she was also accompanied by her very close friend, Donna Leone. Donna Leone is a author of 26 mystery novels. And this is another whole side of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that I think most people are not aware of, that she was a real mystery buff. We went through Geneva and Zurich and a whole bunch of places, yodeling as we went, of course. I think what most sticks with me, there were two things that most stick with me about that trip. One was how totally unpretentious Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. I mean, by this time she was the rock star, and yet you would never know it from the way she spoke with everyone, from the people she would just meet casually to my wife and I and Donna. She just totally without pretense. And the other thing I remember not quite as favorably, she talked the four of us going to see a performance in Zurich of Vosik. And I have to admit, probably shows what a Philistine I am, that I think Vosik is totally pretentious and boring. But she loved it. I was sitting next to her, and she was just mesmerized. And then, apropos what was said earlier by Phil, she went up, or maybe Jamie, but she went up afterwards and spent a huge time with the cast. And again, it was totally unsolicited. I consider her one of the great human beings that I've ever met.
We're getting questions fast and furiously. Keep sending them. I have a question for you, Phil, which is, have you ever argued a case that involved Justice Ginsburg?
I did. I actually argued the last case she heard. It was a case involving the Electoral College, the faithless electors.
Really?
Yeah.
How timely.
When I delivered my rebuttal, the Supreme Court was sine die. It was the end of the session, and that was the last case she heard. And I was able to anticipate the questions she was going to ask me, because we had made an argument involving standing, which involves the legal right of a party to sue. And she is quite the aficionado of civil procedure. And I very much enjoyed that dialogue with her. I only wish I had the chance to chat with her afterwards, where if she might have ever said anything about what she thought of my argument. But I did have the ability to argue before. Now, this is during the pandemic, so it was by telephone. It wasn't in the court. Nonetheless, it's going to be one of the highlights of my life.
What an honor. I mean, that is tremendous and so timely for right now. I'm sure she thought your argument was swell.
Well, I know that she was appreciative that I ran for office. And at the time, I was her only clerk who was elected to public office. Subsequently, this election cycle, a new district attorney in Michigan. Eli's his name, is now also a RBG clerk in public office. And she said to me when I saw her, this would have been in 2019, a title sometimes used for attorney general that is a misnomer, but it's done with some affection, is "How's my favorite general doing?"
Oh my goodness. What an incredible, honor, privilege. And speaking of the Supreme Court and its direction, Andrea, someone asked whether the current conservative drift of the court, 6-3, is her legacy of gender equality at risk?
I think it's all at risk. I think it's a sort of a nightmare scenario. But I think there was also an earlier question as to whether or not some of her tactics are absolutely tactics that we will need to revisit. We've got to make members of the court see how these things impact them. I mean, I think we have to really look at a lot of the issues around marriage. Even I think the nomenclature of talking about marriage equality instead of gay marriage was a really important nomenclature shift that helped people really understand. I think we're going to have to work very hard to craft arguments that take into account, these different perspectives and help people see, what they value is, that's at risk. And so, like, for example, for the ACLU, on abortion, one of the issues, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought Roe v. Wade was decided on the wrong grounds. And, I think as we lift up this issue politically, legally, the issue is still right to privacy, but politically, it's really about who decides, right? And so who do you want to empower, in terms of people's very intimate and personal decisions? And so I think we have to, I think we do have to think about how we craft arguments that take into account the interests of people who have maybe more conservative leanings. And I think that's also part of unifying the country. I think that, is that we have to talk about issues, not so much in terms of liberal, left and right, but really in terms of, the real human costs of a lot of these choices that we have. And that's, that's an important legacy of hers, is really being able to get what we would consider to be a liberal result, but really on solid intellectual grounds.
I see. So learning those lessons and carrying them forward. That question was from Jody Williams, class of 66, just FYI. There was also a question about term limits for Supreme Court justices. They're living longer, and I think Clarence Thomas has been on the court since 1991. So did you ever have any informal exchanges with her about whether justices should be limited to 25 or 30 years? Any of you on the panel?
She was asked the question, and she basically pushed it aside and said something to the effect of, it'll never happen because it'll require a constitutional amendment. The other thing that I know she was aware of is that we've had some justices, of course, RBG herself, but also Brandeis and others who served well past what might be an age limit we could have, or a year limit. It's worth noting a lot of states do have forms of term limits, and I haven't seen a careful study of how that plays out. Part of the issue now isn't term limits per se, but it's the issue about, are we seeing court appointments being more ideologically and politically driven in ways that are dangerous for the legitimacy of the court? If you had an 18-year limit, you would ensure that every 2 years we had a new appointment. And the risk that we're facing right now, when you look at, let's say, the last 20 years, we've had only one election where the Republican elected to president won the popular vote, yet we have had a lot of Supreme Court appointments by Republican presidents. And so the Affordable Care Act is very popular right now, but this Supreme Court is considering whether to strike it down in its entirety.
Next week.
Yeah, next
That's
week, as a matter
happening
of fact.
November 10th.
Right. I and other states are defending the law. If that were to happen, that would be akin to some of other periods of judicial activism that are at odds with the political process. So we have to separate two separate issues, I think. One is, are you doing this because you believe that justices or judges will lose their effectiveness after a period of time? And I think that's where her criticism is probably strongest. But then the second problem is one that a number of questions have touched on. What do we do about the fact that our political polarization is now intersecting with the judicial branch in a way that is threatening the integrity, legitimacy, and credibility of the judicial branch? And I know that Chief Justice Roberts has thought a lot about this and is trying mightily to protect the institutional role of the judiciary. We're going to learn a lot this term, including in this Affordable Care Act case. I'd love to hear what Judge Rakoff thinks about that, because I think the judiciary is, as Alexander Hamilton put it, the least dangerous branch, because it doesn't have, the power of the purse or the power of the sword. It has to build popular confidence in the judiciary, and that's something I'm sure all judges think about.
And Jed, if you could mix in, if you've had any conversations with her about Bush versus Gore 20 years ago.
So on the general topic, like Phil, my impression was that she was not in favor of term limits, although she didn't come out specifically about that in a way that she came out against court packing. But the critical virtue of the federal judiciary is its independence. And anything that can be done to maximize that independence, I think in the long term serves us very well. Lifetime tenure is one of the things that gives judges independence. And there are many, many cases of Supreme Court justices who have evolved over time and become much better justices as they developed their independence. Oliver Wendell Holmes, which many people think was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, justice of the Supreme Court, was there till he was 98. Now I will say, by way of a joke, you may ask the question, what happens to a judge when he develops dementia? The answer, of course, is nothing, because no one knows the difference. But to get serious, I never had an opportunity to discuss Bush v. Gore with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know from mutual acquaintances that she regarded it as maybe the worst judicial opinion of the period of recent decades, but I don't know that for firsthand, so I can't swear to it.
Well, certainly she would not be thrilled at the Supreme Court choosing the next president, one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote. So, Andrea, would you like to comment on originalism and what her critique of originalism might be?
Yeah, that's not my, I'm more in an administrative role these days.
Okay.
Parsing briefs. I do want to though say something about, I think today we do have this sense of a constitutional crisis. I look at Maine, and I was looking at the vote count in Maine, and that, Maine has 2 senators and Fulton County doesn't have, Fulton County, Georgia, or, you look at all the African Americans across the United States, and we've got, 2 senators, one's getting ready to leave, that are African American. We do have this constitutional crisis. The court is part of it. That 9 justices for 325 million people, that that people who never won the popular vote can have so many, put so many people on the court that the Senate, which is again the majority in the Senate, represents a minority of the American population, and yet they're packing the court, and I would say stole 2 Supreme Court seats. So, I mean, I think the Republican Party has delegitimized the court by its own overreach. And so, something has to be resolved about it. I think, if Biden becomes president, he's going to set up some sort of a commission to really look at this issue. Baby boomers are not good at succession planning. I think we have a succession planning problem. And something like what Phil is discussing, where you just knew routinely that every 4 years there would be, 2 new justices rotating around the court, would be something that would, not make it this, this rush. What really feels, from my perspective, because, and for many people in my circles and in the ACLU, the mourning for us is like, are our marriages on the line, or is our right to bodily integrity on the line? Is civil, the Civil Rights Act next, which, Jed says it's one of the most important laws in the United States, but
like a state of emergency
that reversed those things before. So for many, many Americans, this is an existential crisis. The current Constitution of the the people who currently, can.
It sounds like you feel like a state of emergency, kind of a lot of things happening at once, and you're in the eye of the storm at the ACLU. And I might add, 3 justices of the 9 were appointed by, I was going to say a one-term president, but
and so it's, it becomes this chicken and egg. And of course, things like the Electoral College and all these things are vestiges of the slave history, our history as a slave society. And so these things are also, they're just also fraught, and that a minority, right now Joe Biden has 3 million more votes, but that doesn't make him president. Right?
Actually, so, I think he has 4 million more votes.
So, you turn off the TV and
yeah, that is very true. And President Clinton in 8 years only had 2 appointments to the Supreme Court, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was first, and then Stephen Breyer was the second. And Stephen Breyer is 82, or he's getting up there, so he won't. Who knows? All I can say is that what a great irony it is that we're having this conversation on this day when a new president, may be emerging, right? Given her dying wish that the new president would name her successor.
Well, I think that Hillary, what she wanted, I think, was for, the first woman president to be, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil and Jed, my understanding, for the first woman president to be able to appoint her successor. That was one of the things she was hoping would happen. But
can you comment on that, Phil?
It's interesting. I mean, I would say it a little differently, which is there was pressure in, I forgot the year, before the Republicans took the Senate. And at that point, here's the problem from an empathy perspective. She was on top of her game. And that is not an easy thing to do, to step away when you're on the top of your game. The other thing that is notable is she didn't have Marty anymore. So this was her life. So it was a lot, just on a personal level, to ask her to step away. And as for when people step away and when they die, obviously Clarence Thomas retired in 1991. And right before Bill Clinton was elected, and Thurgood Marshall retired in 1991.
Yes, that's right.
Clarence Thomas replaced him in 1991. Very different perspective on the issues that Marshall.
Oh my gosh.
My understanding from the questioning by the Supreme Court justices is that Clarence Thomas also retired in 1991.
In any event, so Thomas, by the way, in defense of Thomas, in my argument he asked a great question. He just doesn't ask questions, but because of the pandemic rules, every justice was given a chance. And he had this great question about of my opposing counsel, under his theory, would Frodo Baggins be someone who could be voted for president? And anyway,
That was his question?
That was his question. It's a really good question. Anyway, but Marshall retired in 1991, and they asked him, why are you retiring? He said, because I'm old and I'm tired.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I remember that very well.
Yeah,
And
my view of Clarence Thomas was that, well, no wonder Bush opposed affirmative action if he thought this was an example of it, because of course Clarence Thomas wasn't, fit to wipe Thurgood Marshall's boots. But I say that because I don't have to go practice in front of them. But this challenge with these. I mean, we had the same tragedy with John Lewis, that is this icon. He's given his whole life. His wife is deceased. Being in Congress was his whole life, and even though he also developed cancer, there's just no idea that you could say don't run for re-election. So we had this crisis when he died while on the ballot. He had already won the Democratic nomination. We had to have an undemocratic. We had to have the party, anoint someone who would fill his seat. Unfortunately, there's a really worthy, but it's crisis. Here's a person who stood for voting rights, and yet his successor was chosen in a way that was not democratic. It was according to the existing rules. But we
lost him in July, and we lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg in September, and they both had this groundswell of mourning and very spontaneous shared grief. I mean, I know people that just went straight to the Supreme Court to be with each other, to say goodbye, to share their sorrow. And it was the same thing with John Lewis. I mean, people were lining up for blocks just to pass by his catafalque, which was the Lincoln catafalque. It was.
If I could remark on that, because there's an important connection between the two of them. They were both civil rights heroes with a very positive attitude. Mm-hmm. They understood what it meant to change hearts and minds. John Lewis, there's this great story he tells in a podcast with David Axelrod, where a young man and his grandfather show up at his office. And the grandfather says, I was there on the bridge that day beating you. I'm sorry. And John Lewis said, I forgive you.
I've heard that story. I heard that he went to Congressman Lewis's office.
Yes.
To have that conversation.
Yes.
And they both, prayed or cried, but John Lewis was so humble and so great at the same time. And I think you could say the same thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't know if they were personal friends, but I'm sure that they were kindred spirits and understood each other. That's a very valuable point about being, shining a light, right? And not being just.
And let me give you another example for
warrior.
RBG. RBG argued before the Supreme Court in the 1970s, and then Justice Rehnquist, mocking her argument for gender equality, said, you're not just going to settle for Susan B. Anthony on the dollar bill? That was where Rehnquist was then. Rehnquist joined her opinion in the VMI case that said women had a right to be admitted to the Virginia Military Institute.
Oh, and she calls him my chief, right?
She loved him, called my chief. And she said Rehnquist grew because he had daughters, and he was able to be empathetic, seeing how his daughters were treated, and that helped shape his thinking in a way that brought him around to her position.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm one of 3 daughters, and my mother says something similar about,
it's really important to remember how so many great Supreme Court justices have evolved over time. And the 2 obvious examples that come to mind are Earl Warren and William Brennan, appointed by Eisenhower. Warren had been a conservative governor of California. Brennan was a Democrat on the New Jersey bench, but he was considered a cautious conservative Democrat in terms of his record up to that point. But once given the independence, the freedom that they got on the Supreme Court, they became people to whom we are just as indebted as we are to Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Well,
Absolutely.
I'm Warren, by the way, to put a fine point on it, he was an enthusiast of putting Japanese Americans into internment camps.
Right, right,
That was his priors on civil rights.
right.
Incredible. Did Justice Ginsburg have a particular historical figure on the court that she put first in her pantheon?
Well, let me add an element here. I don't know that it's fully satisfactory, but I do think she had a soft spot for Justice Brandeis, who was the
That's what I
first
thought too.
Jewish justice. And she did have a real strong connection to her Jewish heritage. She had in her office a quote from the Bible, which was, "Justice, justice shall you pursue."
Ah, justice, justice shall you pursue. So
I-
yes.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I wanted, just because we're running out of time, to take the liberty of mentioning that all of us who were very close to Justice Ginsburg were constantly urging her not to retire, not to, even though, the argument was being made, oh, well, do so before who knows what will happen and so forth.
Mhm.
But as Phil pointed out, she was absolutely at the top of her game. At her 25th anniversary of her being on the Supreme Court, I had the very great liberty of being asked to write a song in her honor, and the last verse of which I will now impose on you. And
Please, feel free.
it's to a tune from a 1930s Gershwin musical called "Of Thee I Sing." Of thee I sing, Ruthie, you have got that certain zing, Ruthie. Everything that you dare seems to reach the heights. Were it not for you, where would be women's rights? Of thee I sing, Ruthie. Madam Justice, you're our everything, Ruthie. You're the warmth of our environment. Please don't even think retirement. Of thee I sing. Anyway, that was my contribution.
We can't
Bravo,
top that.
I
bravo.
don't know what anybody
What a
can say after
performance.
that.
All I can say is that she was discriminated or excluded on the way in, and then at the end of her arc, she refused to leave, and that was the right thing to do. I mean, how many men justices have that pressure put on them? I think she recognized that she had every reason to stay, and that's the way it is.
Well, she became a rock star. I mean, I think one of the most unlikely things was for her to have become such a pop icon. And usually people who really deserve to be heroes are not pop icons. And this was one instance where someone who absolutely deserved every single bit of it actually did get the rock star treatment, to where, little girls have the lace collar
Yes.
and as a mother and grandmother of a granddaughter, I think, the more power. I mean, she's just such a fabulous role model, right down to Marty. So every girl should marry a Marty. So.
Yes, absolutely. Phil, would you like to add anything? We'll have to close the conversation after that.
I will say that for those who watch the documentary movie RBG or the On the Basis of Sex movie, you get a sense of her and Marty. And I do think his commitment to supporting her is part of this story that is so exceptional. And all of us can be inspired to be our best authentic selves as a partner, as a parent, as someone who works for equality, a more inclusive we the people, and towards a more perfect union. That is a legacy that she absolutely leaves us all with, and we should hold on to.
Yes. She expanded the meaning of we the people. Now, I must say, it's been a pleasure, a joy to visit with each of you. And I thought the insights you brought and the crevices of her character are so illuminating. Thank you very, very much. Andrea, Phil, and Jed, our singer. Who knew?
Who knew indeed, right?
Thank you all. Really a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long. Thank you.